Alone in the Dark is an interesting series of horror games to look back on. While it would never go on to be as popular as the franchises it helped inspire, Alone still deserves credit for pioneering the survival horror genre. With its mix of puzzle solving, item management, and combat, it basically created the formula that franchises like Resident Evil would go on to refine and popularize, with that formula still going strong to this day. Despite being such an influential game though, the series would only ever receive a handful of entries throughout the years, with a massive gap in between releases after the third installment. The franchise would get more games throughout the 2000s, but each game would serve as its own attempt at rebooting the franchise, to varying degrees of success. None of them really panned out in the long run, as Atari, or Infogrames as they were known as, sold the rights to THQ Nordic about 2 years ago. While I'm still waiting to see if THQ does anything with the series, and while we're still in this period of downtime, I'd figure it'd be interesting to revisit Alone in the Dark's attempted revivals, and see how each one has held up over the years. The franchise's first reboot came in the form of 2001's A New Nightmare, also known as Alone in the Dark 4. Taking place during a cold Halloween night, paranormal investigator Edward Carnby heads off to Shadow Island after learning that his friend was murdered while investigating famous archaeologist Obed Morden and his tablets. Tagging along is Professor Eileen Cedric to help decipher the tablets, though she has her own personal reasons for coming, as she thinks Morden could be her long-lost father. After a brief introduction, their plane is attacked by some unseen creatures, forcing the two to separate upon landing, and from here you'll get to choose which character you want to play as. Both characters have their own exclusive events, locations, and puzzles to solve, and the story ties back together, so you want to play through both sides to understand the story fully. I don't think there's a right or a wrong character to play as first, but you'll want to try Eileen's route, as she has several character interactions that won't make much sense if you play through Edward's route first like I did. Gameplay wise, it more or less plays out like a standard survival horror game, not shocking considering the franchise's history, but there's been a ton of changes made in New Nightmare. Melee combat, for example, is all but removed in this game, replaced in favor of a greater emphasis on gunplay, with revolvers, shotguns, and grenade launchers to mess around with. Quality of life improvements have also been made across the board. Movement feels much better than the original games, and with the large amount of locations to visit, you're now given a map that can be accessed at any time. With the greater emphasis on combat in this game, you're now given a lock-on button, which for gunplay is appreciated after playing Alone in the Dark 2. You can now carry as many items as you want instead of being limited by inventory space or weight like in Alone 1 or Resident Evil, and documents occupy their own submenu category, meaning they no longer take up precious inventory spots. The visuals have also been greatly improved over the original trilogy, which really does show its age nowadays. New Nightmare, of course, isn't the most technically impressive game to come out by the time it was released, but it was a multi-platform title that came out first on the PS1, so that's something to keep in mind. Still, the pre-rendered backgrounds are quite well detailed, and even on the PS1 version of the game they make great use of the game's lighting effects. Point your flashlight anywhere, outside, or in a dark room, and it will react the way you think it would, despite the game's use of 2D backgrounds. What's cool about this is that it's not just a cool visual effect, it's also used for solving some puzzles and scaring away one enemy type in the early game. The atmosphere to this day is still genuinely top notch, and it really does make you feel, well, alone in the dark. Wandering around the Morden Manor and learning about the family's history, experiencing a few genuine good scares, only having a friendly voice that sometimes keeps you company, solving puzzles, just being constantly on edge. It makes for a good survival horror experience. Unfortunately, there's just a few things that I feel hold New Nightmare back from being a great game. My first gripe with New Nightmare comes from the poor music quality. The voices, the enemy sounds, those are fine, but the music in the PC port sounds horribly compressed compared to the PS1 version. Here, listen. I don't consider myself an audiophile by any stretch of the imagination, as this video shows, but it was something that drove me nuts while playing it. I just don't know if there's something wrong with my copy of the game from GOG, or if this was just a problem with the PC port in general. I couldn't find many reviews from around the time of the game's launch comparing the sound quality between the console and the PC versions. I did find that some critics turned off the music after a while due to its repetitive nature, which that's also true. It can get a bit grating after a while. Compared to other horror games, the soundtrack was just nothing that really stuck with me, and I can't help but wonder if the poor music quality was just down to being poorly converted from the console versions. Another issue I have with this game are the constantly respawning enemies. I feel like this was especially noticeable when playing as Eileen in the early game, and it can become frustrating when you're low on healing items and ammo and you're backtracking to solve a puzzle, or you're lost in trying to figure out where to go. I'm not afraid to admit that I've relied on walkthroughs for reasons like this. The combat in general is just kind of annoying at parts, not because the controls are handled badly, but more because of issues like these and the boss fights. Some bosses are simple damage sponges, but with others I found myself wasting too much ammo when there ended up being something in the environment that I had to use to finish them off. The final boss fights in particular were a huge pain for this reason. You could use up every single bullet you have without feeling like you're doing any damage. It's especially bad for Eileen's fight. The boss fight itself is simple, but getting shots to register was a pain. Beyond this, I don't think I have anything else to offer in terms of complaints. The New Nightmare is still a decent horror title that I could recommend to fans of the genre, with a few asterisks of course. Supposedly this was just meant to be the first game in a new trilogy, but New Nightmare seems to have been the only one made. There seems to have been plans for not one, but two games shortly after launch, but both games seem to have been cancelled by 2003, with only a few screenshots and character models surviving. If I had to guess, New Nightmare just didn't sell enough as expected or left much of an impression, due to releasing on platforms that were well on their way out. By this point, the PS2 was due to launch alongside Silent Hill 2, and if that wasn't bad enough, the Resident Evil 1 remake would have launched a few months after that. New Nightmare sadly did not stand a chance, but there's plenty of ways to experience this title now, so give it a try if it interests you. Of course, the lack of immediate plans didn't mean Alone in the Dark would be permanently shelved, as Atari had its own plans for the series. 7 years after releasing The New Nightmare, Atari launched another reboot of the franchise, this time just called Alone in the Dark, but I'll call it Inferno for short. Inferno was a massive departure for the series, ditching the smaller scale survival horror formula in favor of a more action-heavy cinematic approach. Reception was mixed for both players and critics, with people falling in the camp of putting the game on full blast or going, yeah, it was kind of a mess, but I liked it. I fall into the latter camp myself. Inferno was of course a flawed game, but I just can't bring myself to hate it. When it clicks, it becomes a unique action horror experience you just can't get elsewhere. So let's delve into why. In this game you play as Edward Carnby, not the same one from New Nightmare, but the one from the first game, waking up in present day New York with a bad case of amnesia. Carnby has been kidnapped by a group of cultists, alongside his aging pupil Theo. When the cultists try and separate the two, the entirety of New York goes to hell, literally. While Carnby has to regain his lost memories, he also has to deal with a cult after him and their bizarre infatuation with Theo's stone.
And now it wants it back. What's with this fucking stone?
Inferno takes it a step further, with some even further leaps in logic, with the way a man from the 1920s now talks like Max Payne and knows how to carjack, to seeing Edward sassing a bunch of demons.
Give me my stone! I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway!
The gameplay is mostly straight, and yet it's not afraid to get goofy, giving the game this weird charm to it. Of course, what really stuck with me over the years was the gameplay. Inferno is ambitious in how it has third-person melee combat, driving, environmental puzzles, platforming, and first-person shooting. The game mostly nails it, but it does stumble from time to time. If I had to describe the game, it would be a bit lopsided, as certain parts of the game are easily far more enjoyable and polished than others. Driving, for example, is the worst part of the game. The cars just don't handle that well, and they tend to get stuck on level geometry, and they're at their worst during these scripted driving scenes. These sequences lean more towards a trial and error approach, as you have to get to your objective as quickly as possible, and making a mistake will cause you to restart them at the beginning, with no checkpoints. Thankfully there aren't much of these sequences throughout the game, but you will have to do a fair bit of driving towards the end, but I'll talk about that later. Platforming mostly works how you expect it to. It doesn't feel like there's a ton of weight behind your movement, but beyond that it works fine, and you can even fire your gun while swinging, which is useful. Gunplay is its own can of worms, mostly working from a first-person perspective, but you could also go into this mode by tapping Y at any time. First-person combat mostly works fine, but some enemies don't react well to getting shot, and even with audio aim, I feel like I missed some shots more than I should. To take down most enemies, you'll have to aim at their weak spots, which is their cracks, and you could get a better idea at any time by just closing your eyes and seeing the white outlines on them. Larger enemies can only be taken down with fire as well, so you'll need to craft flame bullets always to put them down. Gunplay isn't the best option though, as the enemies are sporadic and move around quite often, so you will need to improvise with other ways to put them down. This kinda leads into one of my favorite aspects of the game, weapon combinations and inventory management. Carnby keeps things in his jacket, but there's only a limited amount of things he could bring with him, so on top of improvising on the fly, you will have to plan ahead with the right combinations of items. Important items range from batteries to glow sticks to help navigate dark areas. And in terms of weapon combinations, there's things like Molotov cocktails or combining a can of spray with a lighter. This combination in particular is useful for making quick work of some of the game's more infuriating enemies. If you want to plan ahead and swap between weapon combinations on the fly, just set it as a favorite and you'll be able to quickly swap between 4 presets during combat. I was almost never low on supplies since I could just scrounge around the environment and find bullets, healing supplies, or crafting items, so rarely did Inferno ever feel unfair. While the gunplay is fine enough, melee combat just sadly doesn't work well, and it feels like the game pushes you to do it the least because of it. You need to swing the right analog stick to perform actions like breaking down doors or swinging weapons, but it rarely feels good and is often prone to exaggerated motions. There's also the issue that fire is the only way to kill the tougher foes, so swinging a katana won't do much damage compared to lightly brushing a burning object on an enemy. Last but not least were the environmental puzzles, which were a highlight of the game for me. They're simplistic and not as in-depth as puzzles in prior games, but they're still satisfying to pull off and a nice change of pace from the action. There's also moments near the end of the game where it could be genuinely creative, like sections where you have to close your eyes to find out which objects you have to interact with, or when you're navigating some ruins under Central Park and you have to use everything the game taught you to solve puzzles. It's here where Inferno really does show its brilliance at times, and I wish there were more moments like this throughout the entire game. On a technical level, this is a game made in 2008 and it really does show, from the patches you need to apply to get the game running on new hardware to the visuals. Inferno is definitely better looking than some early Xbox 360 games like Saints Row 1, but it's not quite as visually polished as something like BioShock or even early Capcom games like Dead Rising, and despite its age, there's still problems getting this game to run at 60 FPS without stutters. Some aspects haven't aged well, like the barren environments and the lackluster character animations, but others like the lighting and the eerie mist when wandering around Central Park, those still feel top notch. Especially the fire effects, the way it could spread throughout the environment and cause objects to fall apart realistically.
The colors, it turns me on.
It sounds like I have plenty of flaws and nitpicks to talk about with this game, and you could probably do so for hours, but in spite of that, it just kind of washes away when I play it. It is unmistakably janky, and yet there is just some aspect of this game that absolutely clicks with me. For as many reasons as there are to hate Inferno, there's also plenty of reasons to love it as well. Especially the soundtrack, which does a great job carrying the game. But with all that said, the game really does fall apart at the end, and I'm not surprised if it's the reason why most people have problems with it. For the most part, the game moves at a brisk pace, constantly advancing through linear levels, but at the final stretch of the game, the player is expected to travel around the map and burning a bunch of routes. The player is also expected to do this not once, but twice, for no good reason other than to pad out the runtime or to make use of the Central Park map. After you burn down a bunch of routes, you could still bypass this section, but it still feels like something that grinds the pacing to an absolute halt. The PS3 version of this game has several exclusive gameplay tweaks, most notably making this part of the game go by far faster, but the finale is the same no matter what. The reward for burning all of these roots of evil is just mainly a great puzzle section at the end, another terrible driving sequence, and a disappointing ending, which no doubt sours the mood. I wish the developers had a few extra months or even a year to polish up and expand on the ending section of the game, just to see where they would go from this cliffhanger ending. But besides the glaring flaws, I still had a great deal of fun with Inferno. I paid about $2 for an Xbox 360 copy of the game, complete with the soundtrack, and in terms of enjoyment, I felt like I got my money's worth. It absolutely is not a game for everyone, but for people like me that love the idea of MacGyvering objects together and unique action horror gameplay, it's a game worth taking a look in this regard. It's just disappointing that there weren't any plans for a follow-up, or so I thought until I worked on this video. A bit of a detour, but this is still something I found interesting. In 2009, the team at Eden Games started work on a full-on remake of Alone in the Dark, thanks to the commercial success of the reboot. Running on what seems to be the PS3, this build didn't seem to have been in development for long, as some models and environments were still unfinished. We also never got to see the mansion's lower floors, for example, but the end result is still interesting and something worth looking at. Part of what makes this remake so interesting was the time frame around which it was made in. At this point in time, plenty of horror franchises shifted more towards an action-heavy approach, but this remake deserves credit for staying true to its horror roots. In fact, looking at the level design, it feels almost one-to-one with the original, and it could very well have been what our remake was to the original Resident Evil. The environments feel darker compared to the original's arguably more colorful areas, the atmosphere seems to outdo New Nightmare with how unsettling it feels, and it feels like there were even a few things added in to make things feel fresh. It also looks like they redesigned Edward Carnby to keep him looking somewhat closer to his 2008 reboot appearance. I'm not a fan of the addition of QTEs, but this was early on in development, and they could have easily been removed or at least made more minimal with just button prompts on screen. So, why was such a promising remake cancelled? That unfortunately remains unclear, but it seems like it was just due to poor management at Atari or Infogrames. In May 2011, the publisher planned to lay off 51 of the 80 workers at Eden Games, immediately after the release of Test Drive Unlimited 2. Supposedly, this is due to Atari's plans to focus on games like MMOs, and it was said from former employees at Eden that staff there weren't paid as well as those at Atari. Atari claimed that they would support Eden Games back in 2012, but a year later the studio went independent and the remake was cancelled. I wish I could end the video here, but I can't. There's still one more game we have to talk about. Illumination is the latest game in the series, and the last game that Atari ever worked on. And what a note to go out on. I've tried finding information on this game, but I couldn't find a single bit of info on when this game began development, developer interviews, what the developers made before this. It was just more or less unceremoniously dumped on the world. It got a reveal trailer and that was it. Now I kind of understand why this game was made. Atari filed for bankruptcy back in 2013, and they were probably desperate enough to do anything for a quick buck. They tried to target the LGBTQ demographic with a mobile game known as Pridefest, now known as QT Life, and according to reviews is currently unplayable. They wanted to focus on social casinos, whatever those are. They tried to reboot many of their old IPs and were met with failure, and they decided to focus on online games, which led us to this. What's surprising is that this game has been updated over the years, as my gameplay footage really does look different than how it did at launch, and apparently THQ Nordic is still selling this game at $20 retail. Why? I have no idea. I'm not quite sure if there's anything else I could add, since we all know it's a bad game and everyone has given their thoughts about it, but I'll try. Starting off with the good, the environments can look nice as far as a low-budget Unreal 4 engine game can. The environments feel suitably macabre, and I would have loved to explore them in a traditional survival horror game. The soundtrack is suitably moody, and it wouldn't be out of place in any other horror game. The narrator's voice sounds cool, and it seems like there's plenty of character customization options. There also seems to be some form of randomization for levels. The first level will spawn you on different areas of the map from time to time. And that's all the good things I have to say about this game. If I just have to be honest, this game just isn't remotely fun to play. There's 4 classes, but you'll only ever play as Carnby due to his loadout. I don't have any footage of the other classes, but I only played as Carnby due to him having decent starter loadouts, and I have zero interest in grinding in this game, just to get other characters to a point where you could play as them solo. And you have to play this game solo, because there's generally not a single soul playing this game except my dumbass, which makes it worse when some of the objectives seem to revolve around the idea of one person at least helping you out. I mean, I guess it's better that there's no partner AI you have to babysit, but it doesn't make much of a difference either way. It's not like I'm going into this expecting a traditional Alone in the Dark game, but even compared to the 2008 reboot or as a horror-themed co-op shooter in its own right, combat is just awful. Enemies are only weak when exposed to a light source like a flaming barrel, a street light, or when you set them on fire with your flamethrower. Since you kinda have to work to unlock the flamethrower now, if you don't find any light sources nearby, you're kinda screwed since enemies will turn into damaged sponges, and they rarely stop spawning on the medium difficulty setting. I guess they wanted to combine the light and fire based combat of the last 2 games, but instead it really ends up feeling like this really bad version of Alan Wake's combat. Enemy variety is alright I guess, but what bosses I've encountered were just boring. It just felt like I was finding the same stationary objects again and again. As for the levels, they're just kind of boring. I've said that the environments can feel macabre, and I still stand by that. But that's in the rare case when they actually have something interesting to look at, like exploring an old graveyard near a church or an abandoned town. Illumination has a major fascination of having the player go through what feels like an identical series of corridors of abandoned mine shafts, for what feels like no good reason besides the fact that they probably made this game on a super low budget and had to stretch out the levels somehow. They're not nice to look at, and they're even less fun to play, especially because of the fact that this game makes use of a frustrating stamina system. You run fast enough, but your stamina drains really quickly, and once that's completely drained, you're forced to walk at what feels like a snail's pace. It's definitely not what you want when you're swarmed by a large group of enemies. There's also the odd technical issue, like AI acting weird from time to time, the poor animations, which I've seen better even in other low-budget Unreal Engine games, the odd frame rate dip concerning the game's visuals, the story only being told via narration, which again, probably because of budget reasons, there's only so many ways you could say that this game is not good, and I'm not quite sure this game could really get better in any state. It's hard to imagine this game being anything other than mediocre at best. Even when compared to other weird horror spin-offs, this just felt like a bad idea from the start. And again, THQ Nordic is still asking for a standard retail price of $20 on this when it's not on sale, which is outrageous considering the game's quality. Even when it goes on sale for $5, there's leagues better indie games you could play on Steam for the same price that go for the same price or less, and even then there's better games you could play on Steam for free. Even if you're someone like me that's fascinated by bad games, there's no reason you should ever actually play Illumination. Just let it be as a game forgotten to time. One that should be looked at as a curiosity, but not one you should ever actually play. While there's no doubt that Illumination was a huge letdown, I don't think we'll have to worry about another game like this, as Atari is no longer handling the franchise, as I said earlier. Looking at the quality of THQ Nordic's remasters, I'm sure they could easily give the same treatment there to Alone in the Dark, but I am a bit worried to see where the series can go from here. I'm certain they'll remake one of the games as a safe bet, but after that, then what? Looking back on Alone in the Dark as a series, it always felt like the kind of game that was trying to reinvent itself, not just in terms of gameplay, but in settings and mythologies used. On the plus side, this gives a lot of creative freedom to any studio in charge of the series. On the other hand, it makes me worried to see what they'll look to for inspiration, and if they'll still use the light damages enemies aspect of the game over making a survival horror game inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. But I guess there's no sense in worrying about it now, since we're probably still far off from playing a new game in the series. All I just want at this point is a game that can walk the thin line between pleasing series vets and attracting new fans at the same time to this unique series of games. So long as it just does that, I consider it a job well done, and I hope if nothing else this video has at least gotten one person into checking out the series as a whole. But that's all I have to say for now, so until next time, thanks for watching.